Encryption keeps millions of people across the world safe, and it's doing that every day.
Millions of Ukrainians have downloaded end-to-end encrypted apps to message loved ones and share their stories with the world.
Safety is the most important thing for Ukrainians.
Encryption is playing a key role in keeping women safe when their reproductive rights are being eroded.
Encryption is safety.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Pratik Wagre, and I want to formally welcome all of you to the part of the people, the Encryption Summit. The summit is being hosted by the Global Encryption Coalition Steering Committee, and today we're going to feature a number of events that highlight the impact of encryption on individuals and societies around the world. We'll also explore many ways in which encryption empowers people, protects privacy, and safeguards sensitive data. There's a few housekeeping things I have to go through, so let me just quickly share my screen. I hope you can see that, right? So this is being hosted on Zoom events, right? And it's a webinar, so everyone, but not everyone attending today will be on camera and will be able to speak as part of the sessions. But the chat function is available. You should see that on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can keep adding in comments through the chat. The summit is being presented in English, and simultaneous interpretation is also available in French and Spanish. And I believe you should be able to choose the language by clicking on the globe icon. Closed captions are also available in English, Spanish, and French. And again, you can select the option that you want through the closed caption icon. I am quickly going to stop sharing and move into the first panel or the first discussion for today. Right now, we're calling this power to the people, right? So it's only fitting that then we're starting with a region that has about 25% of people in the world today in South Asia, right? Now, regulatory developments, social practices, attitudes prevalent here, impact a quarter of the living people. Today, this applies to broader questions of internet governance, as well as, for the audience today, specifically what happened with aspects like end-to-end encryption, right? Now, if you look at a number of global reports or indices about press freedom, right? Whether it's the World Press Freedom Index, Freedom on the Net, the South Asia Press Freedom Report, so on. A lot of them point to the general trend of a worsening environment for freedom of expression in the region and increasing threats to press freedom, right? Now, this could be in the form of specific laws that are being enacted or likely to be enacted, selective enforcement of ones that already exist, arbitrary detentions, threats to business models, ownership in some of these, in companies, and in extreme cases, unfortunately, even taking lives, right? So the global community then becomes important for us to situate our conversations and actions about secure communications, about privacy, about security in these regional contexts as well. Right now, while I realize we don't have all the countries represented today, we're still hoping that through today's conversation, we're able to highlight some of the issues related to freedom of expression in the region and the state of play with regard to how it interacts with the use of secured communication in general and specifically end-to-end encryption. Right. So with that, I want to briefly introduce you to today's speakers. I'll start with Seema Chishti, who is the editor at The Wire in India. We also have joining us Faria Aziz, the co-founder of Bolo Bhi, from Pakistan. And we also have Ambika Satyanaranthan, who's a lawyer and human rights advocate in Sri Lanka. We are expecting another member to join us. I think there could be difficulties. I'll introduce them nevertheless anyway. And if we're able to have them along the way, that will be great. Jula Salam, who is the bureau chief at the Associated Press in Bangladesh, is also expected to join us. So with that, I think we can now go into it, right? And I want to start with you, Faria. And could you maybe take us through, or start off by telling us what the environment is like for the press and rights defenders in Pakistan today? What are the challenges that the community as a whole faces, and then maybe perhaps specifically with regard to the use of end-to-end encryption, as WhatsApp, Signal, etc. Have there been any suggestions, threats that you believe compromise people's ability to use these communications?
Thanks, Pratik, and hello, everybody. Pratik, I'll begin with, it's unfortunate, but the situation, especially the given current political climate, I would say is quite volatile. And we've seen, every time we think it can't get worse, it somehow does. And particularly for political workers, journalists, dissidents, it's been particularly bad. And so we've had a wave of arrests, detentions, trials on the basis of, expressing political support even. And so with respect to, because we're discussing the digital sphere, etc., just to give everybody an overview of the regulations that exist in the country. The primary one, I would say, is the Cybercrime Law, which is the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and this was enacted in 2016, despite a lot of pushback, because there are a lot of speech restrictions in there. Speech has been criminalized. There's also obviously real-time recording of data, the surveillance provisions, and then in terms of privacy infringement, on paper per se, there's a requirement for, let's say, warrants before devices can be taken and content can be disclosed. But in practice, we know this is not what happens. I've rarely come across a request for a warrant. Typically, what tends to happen is that a first information report, which we know as an FIR in this region, is registered. And then usually the charges follow later. First, the person is picked up. And I say picked up because it's literally an abduction. And then they are detained at a local police station or in the custody of the Federal Investigation Agency. Then the formal charges are brought, and typically a combination of cognizable, non-cognizable offenses where they gain powers to arrest, etc. So that is then constructed against them. By this time, the person's already in custody, the devices are already in custody. A lot of people are compelled to give their passwords, or they gain entry to the devices that they have seized. And despite the fact that protections against self-incrimination and everything exists in the Constitution and protections exist on paper in the law, in practice, this is not followed. So we've seen, obviously, the registration of criminal cases, and because we're also talking about encryption and this predates the cybercrime law as well. So we've had, let's say, this telephony regulation from 2010. And time and again, the Telecommunications Authority would issue ads saying that everybody has to register their VPNs. Now, the thing is that in Pakistan, your SIM, your phones, everything, there's biometric registration, everything you have to register. And then from time to time, they say also VPNs, or there will be a disruption. Now, with respect to VPNs, of course, people use them. And there are these occasional requirements for registration, or you won't be able to use them. And we frequently have internet blockades as well, where sometimes the whole, the internet itself will be switched off, as we saw a couple of months ago, or certain services will be blocked. They take a mild attitude towards it in terms of enforcement. So they know that people do use VPNs. It's not a hard out enforcement. They're going to go after them and they're going to criminalize them for the use of VPNs. But of course, from time to time, they do try to make it more difficult. Curiously enough, when YouTube was blocked for 3 years, and I remember that this was in court when we were there for the proceedings, because the ban had been challenged, and when questioned, when the judge questioned that, is YouTube inaccessible, the telecommunications official said, well, yes, it's inaccessible, but people use proxies, and the question was, do you do something about it? But not really. So it's sort of that policy will look the other way in certain circumstances. But that essentially is in terms of the regulatory environment. And the most pressing concern is, of course, the abduction charges of journalists and dissidents. And so when you gain physical access to devices, it becomes a huge problem. And I'm sure we're going to go into other areas in terms of what do journalists or dissidents do to protect themselves. But a lot of these protections, in these circumstances, then don't hold. I'll stop here and then we'll add it.
Okay, no, thank you for setting that that initial context. Seema, I'll come to you now, and in terms of the Indian context, I think it would be helpful for you to talk us through what are the barriers to freedom of expression currently in the Indian context today. What kind of instruments the state deploys, right? And again, specifically, with regard to end-to-end encryption, WhatsApp signal, etc. Have there been any, in your opinion, are there major threats that we should be mindful of as a community?
So instruments that are deployed is very interesting because we're increasingly seeing what is happening offline by way of subjugations and violations of literally fundamental rights of freedom of expression and speech that Indians are expected to have and should have and have had are being kind of really put down, and instruments are playing a very key role in that. So a lot of the new digital laws, protocols, and how they're being interpreted by police authorities are mirroring the kind of repression measures that we're seeing offline. That's critically what's happening. I want to just pull back a little bit to kind of help people who may be reading about India but not knowing it so closely to understand what's exactly happening. For this government in power, the 2019 election, which re-elected Mr. Modi, was called the WhatsApp election. So at that time, a lot of people didn't understand what it meant, but to really understand how the everyday politics, the business of re-election, the business of keeping in power is linked in with the control of the online space. And this kind of the importance of the online space has really been rising. This is principally for two reasons. One is, of course, the sort of external push to talk about the digital public infrastructure to make it look good, where China is kind of portrayed as a firewalled kind of a place. The Western world is portrayed as like too open. India is kind of seen as the Goldilocks of the authoritarian zone, if you like. But that's kind of dressed up as a very likable digital public infrastructure, which clearly the government of India thinks gives it kind of an entry ticket on the global high stage to be able to talk about this, especially with the payment system. All this is facilitated by the ease of being able to link everything to the national identity system called Aadhaar, which gives it's kind of like a one-stop shop for your identity, which allows which is like really bad news. Kind of, it allows all identities to ultimately go back to the Aadhaar number. So if somebody has your Aadhaar number, it means you can crack my banking, you can crack everything. My date of birth, when I got married, etc. But anyway, so apart from this kind of global thing that the desire to be on the global stage, as it were, locally, we've been watching how the governments spend on digital ads and on pushing advertisements and propaganda on digital has been far exceeding what they've been doing on legacy media. So digital is like really important. What we're seeing now from a very sophisticated sort of Pegasus spyware driven complicated way of rounding up people, we now have really something akin to what Fariha was saying. So even if not abductions, the police is coming home. It's actually coming home to kind of digital media. So we must recognize this big switch that's happened to an almost sledgehammer approach, where of course it's important to protect encryption, but more than encryption, it's now about seizing devices. The Supreme Court of India is about to hear a very important matter on the rights that human beings have to devices in India, and which are the legitimate rights reinforced again by the landmark privacy regulation, the judgment by the Supreme Court in 2017. That will be heard in early November. But till then, hash values are seldom given. They don't even need warrants. They could knock on my door now and not even necessarily tell me what's wrong. And increasingly, acts of expression, reporting on stories are being criminalized. So first information reports are being filed against journalists, whistleblowers are under attack, and even a digital portal like NewsClick has been put down for being a terrorist. So that's basically it. Do I have a little more time, or shall I stop for now, Prateek? I have a little more time.
You actually do have more time. We have some
okay.
I think the timing restrictions are relaxed a little bit now.
All right. Okay. So essentially what the government has succeeded in doing is to confuse the line between regulation and censorship. So you have government bodies which are claiming to now be fact check units, which are straightforward government of India bodies, and they'll tell you what's okay and what's not okay. And if it doesn't meet a government idea of what is okay, it can be taken off air. The other thing we need to be mindful of is a sort of a carrot and stick approach to big tech. So there are a sort of cozying up plus kind of, because India being the big market that it is, I think it's kind of the largest growth area for Meta, for even Twitter, for of course, for Facebook and for Amazon and for everyone. So in order to sort of tell them that you can stay only if you do our bidding, so you use partly carrot, partly stick to kind of make them play ball. So the Indian citizen, the digital animal, as it were, and we're all pushed online, is forced to kind of is squashed between big tech and government. So it's not even the kind of a European scenario where there is a fine regulation, there's regulation, there is government, which its risks, and there is big tech on the other side. Here we're facing it's like a fixed match with two formidable people who joined up against the citizens. That's the kind of a scenario we have. And a very, encryption, a final point about how Indians, and I think South Asians generally, that because we live in crowds, etc., privacy doesn't matter. So why should encryption matter? This is constantly pushed by people in power that, if you've got nothing to hide, give your phone, take away everything. But I think people are increasingly now getting mindful of it, which is a good thing. A lot of cinema has helped, a lot of OTT shows, which are talking about scams, about identity theft, how it can take away my bank, a lot of banking scams. India has seen a lot of the absence of cyber security has alerted people to that. And I think the fact that the mobile phone is a singularity of everything. It's got everything from my grocery bills to my conversation with my lover to the news bulletin to everything. So now people are getting kind of conscious and mindful about somebody just having access to that. And I think particularly banking scams, which have seen a record rise in the 2022-2023 financial year, have alerted people to that.
Okay, thanks for that. Ambika, I'll come to you. And again, a similar question in terms of what are the broad contours of the freedom of expression conversation in Sri Lanka. And of course, as we speak, there is a lot of activity happening around an online safety bill, right, which was recently introduced in the parliament there. Does that have specific implications for, what are the general implications of it? If you could talk about that maybe a little bit towards the end, and if there's specifically anything about end-to-end encryption there that we should be worried about.
Sure. Thank you. Listening to Seema and Fariha, I feel like, we're just kind of repeating what each other is saying, because it's pretty much the same in our region. And when Fariha said, well, when we think it can't get worse, it does. I think in Sri Lanka, our motto is, it will always get worse. That we are prepared for. So what we have now is, it's an authoritarian, a government with authoritarian tendencies, because although the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his brother, who was the prime minister, they resigned last year. The person who is prime minister now and the person who is president now was also elected by parliament by the political party, that is the Rajapaksa family's party, as it were. So the authoritarian tendencies continue, and Sri Lanka has been a country that has where we've seen deaths, abductions, arrests, harassment, intimidation of journalists over the last several decades, also particularly during the armed conflict or the civil war here. And none of those, no one has been held accountable for the deaths and the disappearance. Where the regulatory framework is concerned, until now, you could say we didn't have anything particularly targeting the cyber space, but we did have other laws which they used to target also people using social media and to curtail freedom of expression. Like, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act, which is whereby we pass legislation in Sri Lanka to give effect to the ICCPR. Now, that is supposed to protect our rights, but that has often been used against dissenters and even journalists. So, for instance, a poet was imprisoned under that act. A short story writer was imprisoned under the act, where they said that they were inciting hatred and violence against certain communities. Then we have the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Under that, we had in the past one conviction of a journalist. But what it is used for now and for many years now is merely as a sword that hangs over your head, and it is used to summon journalists and civil society for inquiry by the Terrorism Investigation Division. And of course, we have now the Online Safety Bill, which you mentioned, which does have an impact, because there we have a powerful commission with quasi-legislative and judicial powers. And the commission, for instance, can apply for a court order to demand the identity of a user from an intermediary. So this would have impact on encryption. There are vague offenses, like, for instance, outraging or creating ill will towards communities, or outraging the religious sentiments of a community, these vague offenses. And of course, there's another particularly worrying provision where civilian experts can be enlisted under this proposed law, and a police officer of not lower than the rank of a sub-inspector can actually delegate their power to the expert. And what can the expert do? The expert can just even demand devices, can demand information on internet traffic, and all without a court order, mind you. Then we also have right now, although the government has withdrawn it temporarily, but it was proposed just a few weeks ago, the anti-terrorism bill. So this too has an impact on freedom of expression, because, for instance, they say if confidential information is shared, and then that can be an offense, confidential information that is detrimental to national security. Once again, what is confidential information? What is something, the definition is not specific. So journalists and others dissenters, human rights advocates can be targeted under this law. For us, I think the cyberspace is very important because now if you take, for example, the Aragalaya or the people's protest that all of you would have seen that happened last year, that started, yes, we did have small protests at street corners, but also social media played a huge role, not only in mobilizing, but also recording violations by the state, by violence against protesters, by the police and by the military. And that is what changed people's perception and garnered a lot of support for the protest movement. Even at that time, even without the online safety law that the government is now proposing, the government did arrest people for making statements. And for this, they used a very old provision in the penal code, which is, it says if you're exciting or attempting to excite disaffection towards the president and the government. So it's vague, it's broad, but that was used. And that was even before the online safety law. And that created a sense of fear, which is the whole purpose of the online safety law as well, to create fear amongst just the average citizen, but also human rights advocates, dissenters, journalists, so that they would not make these statements, and also to regulate intermediaries and internet service providers. The excuse that the government uses is, of course, that it wants to prevent or address online harms. But what we have seen, for instance, in 2018, we had the Digana riots when Facebook was at that time used to incite violence. Now, this is something that even Facebook or Meta now has acknowledged, and did acknowledge at the time. And the irony is that those who incited the violence are right-wing groups that do have the support of the state, that do have the support of the Rajapaksa family at the time. And they are the ones who are using this, but the law is drafted as an excuse or justification is to address these harms, but actually target dissenters, human rights activists, and journalists. I think, do I have any time left, or?
I think we've got about a minute. So
Okay,
if
then
you want
that's
to
fine. So we can just follow up. That's fine. You can go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I think I've made them. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think it's striking to hear the parallels across it. And if I can, and in these situations, you're also tempted to make light of some of the hopelessness, right? So if I can reduce this all into an XKCD comic, right, and I'll just bring it back into the encryption scenario. There's this very famous one that a lot of people are familiar with, right? About all sorts of encryption, and then you have the $5 wrench, right? Except yeah, in this case, it seems like it's not a $5 wrench, and borrowing Seema's example, it's a sledgehammer of the state, right? That's coming after the ability to express ourselves freely. On that note, let maybe move on. Just coming back to, I think what would also be helpful to understand is how the community is responding, right? Maybe Seema, I'll come to you first this time. How are people responding or adapting to this in a more general sense? And of course, again, maybe coming back to the encryption sense, is do you perceive, or do you see in your circle around you a shift in how people are maybe using secure communications at all or not? And I guess more broadly also, since we're a global community, what can the community do, keeping the region in mind?
So I remember vividly the kind of, anti-net neutrality thing that was kind of carried out. At that time, that was like 2016, when there was a massive kind of online campaign. It kind of differentiated the nerds from the ordinary users of online. There was a huge divide between people who understood what was going on and between people who did not, but were still using digital. I think that divide is now dissolving. So people are becoming more aware as there's more of a kind of a digital creep into our lives. I mean, creep is like the understatement of the century, but you know what I mean. So, whether it is a rural kind of woman somewhere who needs her Aadhaar and the net to work for her to get wages, or for her to get a bag of food grains, to some heavy duty techie trying to do some big thing online. So people are aware of what internet shutdowns do to them. People are aware of the need for digital privacy to secure their kind of fingerprints, their biometrics, etc. So I think overall there's a huge increase in awareness, but as far as people like as far as human rights defenders go, journalists go, there is a lot of sometimes misplaced the whole thing about let's use this app and not the other. But there's this huge preference for Signal even amongst government servants. So even government officials do not want to speak to you on the regular line. So I presume there's a huge dip in kind of phone revenues, because everybody seems to have switched to their favorite app, come to me on Telegram or come to me on Signal. So there is that kind of understanding. There are jokes about large WhatsApp ads that kind of, that we keep you secure, etc. So there is that kind of understanding amongst those who already understood a little bit, but are now firmer on it. They're not laughing at privacy concerns anymore as being, things of an adulterous person, or about the super rich who wants to ship money away. So it's moving from that sense of the elite thing. I think what the global community and what everyone else can do is constantly drive this point home, that what we are owed digitally by governments who push and force certain actions onto the digital sphere, then is that we must get the same rights then that we would get if we were offline. So if you're forcing me on a banking app, or you're forcing me to conduct conversations, so if I'm having a conversation with my school friend in a room here somewhere, somebody sitting next to me, the state would not be able to hear. So you cannot tell me that for reasons of terror concerns, I have to listen to the same school friend you're speaking to if you're speaking digitally. So I think that kind of understanding has to be made very clear. I hope the coming elections kind of make people more aware, make political parties more aware, so that they can put it on in the manifestos, and it can become something that is a right. What global communities can do, I don't know, maybe more kind of awareness stuff, little memes and things. We share global experiences. I know that Brazil, a whole lot of lawyers insisted and said that before elections, WhatsApp could not opt for a community program, which would allow for faster dissemination. The argument being that it was also, so maybe it's not WhatsApp's fault, but it was acting like as a force multiplier for false news and misinformation. So the lawyers stood up and forced WhatsApp to postpone communities in Brazil. So maybe that drive can also be led by that. And as I said, OTT platforms, stories, comics, and things coming up which emphasize how the absence of cybersecurity and why privacy and encryption is possible. And fundamentally, I think that the privacies I'm entitled to offline, I have to be entitled to those online. Just because I'm online doesn't mean I'm available for the government to scrutinize and rip through my life.
Thanks, Seema. Faria, I'll come to you next. Again, similar question in terms of what from what you've seen has been the response like. Has there been a shift? Especially in the calculus in terms of, hey, this keeps me more secure versus this is easier to use. What's been your sense from that perspective? And I guess similar question in terms of, is there something that the global community can do or should keep in mind when thinking about the South Asian context?
So, Prateek, the thing is that even with the cybercrime law or with digital safety, right? When something happens is when the concern arises, even for journalists who maybe and who are on the state's watch list or, charged by the state, etc. And no amount of preempting or saying you should have certain settings or you should have certain knowledge, or the fact that, there isn't that level of preparedness. Unfortunately, those things only kick in once something comes to pass. So that's why. So in terms of convenience, it's always convenience trumps security, right? So for example, WhatsApp, everybody knows the open line, like Ma mentioned, nobody's going to use, nobody's SMSing, nobody's using the open line. For a fact that somebody's listening in. But then, of course, you're switching to WhatsApp. Now, there will be some who will switch to Signal, but you see, the thing is, it's also about adoption and the number of people using a particular app, right? And your outreach, and whether you're in groups where that's your source of information as well, or conversation and narrative building and other things. Then we see there's also a lot of so one way that people tend to be targeted is through hacking into accounts, right? Just taking or leaking information from their accounts. Now, sometimes I have discovered while trying to get some of these journalists, let's say, to recover their accounts, that even basic things were not done by them, right? Whether it's two-factor, whether it's other things, whether it's don't have the same password. And I'm talking about basic. And then over a decade of doing digital safety trainings, I will walk into a room, I will throw out the question, and there will be a handful of arms which will say, yes, we have the same password for everything. No, we don't have a two-step. No, we don't have login verifications, right? So still people will not do or maximize the settings that are available. So I think the one way of helping, especially at a global level, is what can you do at the back end to maximize security, right? So when we move from end to end, so from open to end, and it's all going to be encrypted, which is great, but also we know that the government and others have been investing in filtering technology and deep packet inspection and surveillance tech over a period of time. And so we're now also facing challenges where the device itself may be infected, depending on, the people. Now, what do you do in that scenario? And then again, who can you go to? And you don't want to necessarily advertise there's this organization, there are these people giving you this service that they can check your devices and give you certain tips, etc., because you also want to be a little discreet about this. But these are some of the, and also what we are finding is that if, for example, now if a device has been seized, now physically, like we spoke earlier, right? And there seems to be a regional pattern. then one, either the device will not be returned to you. Even if it is returned to you, you do not want to use it because most likely malware has been put on that device and it has been accessed. And so now there's the issue of one, the dissident journalist incurring the cost of buying new things, but also what do you do? But what do you do with all that data that's lying and that has been accessed elsewhere, right? And you don't have the time to wipe it. You can't do a remote wipe. So these are all of these issues where tech journalists are really not techies, that we've really found, right? And so, and not even journalists, these are also human rights, let's say lawyers who are being targeted at the moment, right? And lawyers defending people for all kinds of cases. And so they're also being targeted with cases and detentions and all of that. So this is a huge issue. So in terms of the capacity, the skills, etc., it won't be putting the onus on the individual to enhance their capacity, because that will only happen at a very limited scale. The other thing is that, in terms of, we have become so used to, unfortunately, in our political environment, where audio leaks, video leaks, because that is how you discredit an opponent or an individual or a dissident, right? Leaked audio, leaked now, all of this we know is illegal, but the effect is there's great currency to it, right? Because a lot of people have seen it. So whatever the intended effect was, it's all done. And how do you protect against that? Disinformation campaigns that are run, women journalists are targeted, a specific gendered nature of abuse that they have faced. And so at various levels, these things have been raised, but there's little remedy. Also the turnaround times, when you, let's say, turn around to platforms, and that cultural understanding, a lot of things are also happening in regional languages or local languages. And so that context sometimes gets lost as well. It's very difficult, especially in our context, sometimes explain that when somebody is being threatened with a blasphemy campaign is being run against somebody, there's a very real likelihood of them, the offline violence occurring in that context as well, right? Now, just because, it is a campaign that says, oh, charge them under the law, but charge them under the law is actually a target on their back. And so it may not, it seems innocuous, they're just saying charge them under the law, but the charge them under the law comes with a lot of other things into the context, right? You're already painted as this target for people to go after. And similarly, something Seema mentioned in terms of government setting up these fact check organizations, which is, completely antithetical to what the function, because you're trying to check the disinformation that is being peddled by the state as well, right? And we've had this under the previous setup, where we had the Ministry of Broadcasting set up this a Twitter account which would put these big red cancel signs on certain journalists and saying, fake news buster, actually that was called. And it's just that, when you come from that, and there's that then leads to dog whistling and a lot of abuse, etc. And interestingly, what, Seema also mentioned about the 2019 being a WhatsApp election, I mean, in the Pakistani context, the 2018 elections and the rise of the PTI and Imran Khan, the whole phenomena was using the online space. And what is happening right now? So overnight, right, this party, which was led, everything social media, right? They were the most social media savvy party. Then obviously there were 4 years of the same page, the same script that, sort of follows in the country. Then, the populist prime minister is ousted. He's currently in jail. The party is being dismembered, something that we've seen before. Now they're being charged under Official Secrets Act. And, as Amka also mentioned, in the Sri Lankan context, you have the Anti-Terrorism Act. You have, so similarly in Pakistan, Anti-Terrorism Act, the cybercrime law, penal code provisions, sedition, inciting mutiny, this, that, and the other, all are being applied. There are military trials of civilians happening. Geofencing was used to identify people and pick them up from the location. And you may have happened to just be there for any other reason. You could live on that street, but because certain things happened on that street, you've been rounded up and put in jail. And there's a particular sort of political context. We are currently under a caretaker setup. The elections are already delayed. We do not know when the elections are going to take place. And the unfortunate part is that, so a lot of this happens with regulations and without also. The caretaker setup is the mandate has been increased by law by the outgoing government. And so in the legislature, over 90 bills were passed. In 90 laws were passed, just before they were going in sort of the last month of legislation. Among them, we have a e-safety and bill that was also on the books, but it has not been turned into an act. But what they are trying to do is, so we have the cybercrime law, real-time monitoring, but what they want is that whole carrot and stick approach. The funny thing is, though, at least in India, you have the companies have been registered and been operating and on ground and legally present, right? So it's really, I don't understand where they come from in Pakistan. We don't have legal physical presence. Yet that approach is used where we're going to, switch off services. Okay, sure. But when you put in social media rules that you have to register, you have to appoint staff, you will be fined. The thing is that then these companies they can decide not to come at all. You're not in India in terms of a population size market or the fact the companies already exist, right? And you're sending off these sort of signals. But that is the direction that we are still headed in terms of, even with data privacy legislation, it's about how can you provide the state access to information? So it's less about protecting the individual and the user. How can we get more access to servers? So they want servers here. They want access to those servers whenever. And this, of course, is a red flag that we see going forward also.
Thanks, Faria. I think we can all see the similarities across. Ambika, I'll come to you now again, giving you sort of the last word on this. Also to, I think, maybe finish the thought that you were on in the previous round. If you want to do that, that's fine as well. And also this similar question in terms of what's been the response like in Sri Lanka to this to moves to restrict the freedom of expression, and again keeping the what should the global community sort of keep in mind?
So I mean, like in other parts of the region, I think the disinformation and misinformation is being spread by the state, its affiliates and right-wing groups that are enabled by the state or enabled by certain political parties. And so the lawmaking that we see is not concerned about protecting the privacy and the rights of the citizens, but more about protecting the authoritarian state. Now, for us, whether, digital security, digital hygiene is concerned, people are aware, but not aware in the sense that they know there is a lot of suspicion and paranoia, right? And I think that is quite normal also in this region because we are conspiracy theorists as well. So there is that paranoia and fear. So they might download Signal, but they won't have the disappearing messages on. They would have Signal, but they would prefer to use WhatsApp. And even now, some people call on the normal mobile line to discuss, serious issues related to human rights, etc. And of course, the use of VPNs, that is something that people have used here because in the past few years, we've seen several internet shutdowns. And so VPNs were used to circumvent this, particularly during the people's protests when it happened, because we also have this declaration of the state of emergency. And the government at times declared a state of emergency. And then during those times also, we saw that there were sometimes attempts to shut down the internet. And funnily enough, during one of those times, even Mahinda Rajapaksa's son used VPN to tweet during this time and was made fun of on Twitter by others also using VPN. Encryption, yes. I mean, people, not everyone. Now, we also have human rights activists and journalists working outside in the region, small community groups that work with groups like, let's say, Families of the Disappeared. Now, not everyone can afford smartphones, and the internet connections in many of these areas also will be patchy. We still have people who are, who have hard copy documents. So documents are not saved and secured digitally. For example, in 2019, when everyone was afraid that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was going to be elected president, I know many community-based organizations that actually burnt documents because they did not want those documents to be accessed, but they did not save them digitally before that happened. Not all of them did that. And of course, the gendered nature of abuse we see here. We find that young women in particular are unaware of how to secure themselves. We see increasing number of cyber violence against young women. We see doxing. We see, revenge porn being circulated on social media. And of course, the remedies are limited. If you go to the police, you're not treated seriously. I would actually be petrified, and I would tell them not to, because you would not be treated in a gender sensitive manner. You might have to surrender your devices. That means they have access to it, and that makes the young women more vulnerable to further harassment or violence by the police themselves. And of course, women activists and women politicians are targeted, where they set up fake accounts, fake photos, or sometimes the women's accounts are hacked. We've had to reach out to Meta and others several times to deal with this. The importance of social media, and I would like to reiterate, in Sri Lanka, we've seen it have an impact. Now, for instance, yesterday, because 45 petitions were filed in the Supreme Court challenging the online safety bill. So yesterday, the Attorney General stood up, and for 3 hours, he presented amendments that they are proposing to the bill. Now, there are some they've addressed some concerns, but there are still many concerns left. But the fact that they are doing it is also due to public protest, and public protest that has been enabled and magnified through social media more than even the legacy media. So that's why it's so important to protect this space. For us, what a positive thing that we did see is that the Asia Internet Coalition, they issued a statement criticizing the online safety bill. So big tech needs to push back. And this, I think, here, one of the benefits is that we're not in India. I think Faria also said is we're not in India. So we're a small market. So therefore, big tech might not bow down to the state and instead might push back if the Asia Internet Coalition statement is anything to go by. So that's a positive thing for us, the fact that we aren't a large market. And of course, finally, I think it was Seema who spoke about offline rights. We need to have online rights as we have offline rights. But in the region, what we see is that our offline rights are being undermined, our constitution, the laws that protect our rights. And in that instance, I think we're also at a loss as to how do we're battling very hard to and firefighting every day to protect that space. And therefore, many people have moved from that space to cyberspace, and that is perhaps for some of them the only space they have, and now they're focusing or they're targeting that space as well. So what do we do? In some instances it does feel rather hopeless, but I think here there isn't enough learning and sharing between civil society, journalists, human rights defenders, because our states do that very well. They share information, practices, strategies, all their bad practices. They learn from each other, they replicate them. But I don't think we do it enough. And that is something that we must do, because the region as a whole, we do see a threat to our freedoms, both offline and online.
Thank you, Ambika. I think you summed it up very well in the end in terms of the states learning from each other. And I think as a community for us to maybe be able to do more, while keeping in mind that a lot of us are fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts in any way. But again, I want to thank all of you, Ambika, Faria, Seema, for providing your insights today, your input, and I'm hopeful that everyone who joined today has learned a lot more about the context in South Asia and how a lot of us are dealing with some of the evolving situation here, and are able to situate some of that better as a lot of us go back and think about the role that encryption plays in a lot of these geographies. It also looks like from the I've been skimming through some of the responses that have come in on chat, and it seems like a lot of what you've said also echoes with people in other parts of the world as well, right? So I think it's a challenge that globally a lot of us are facing, and I think thanks to people like you, thanks to many others who are not on the call, who keep fighting. Right, and I guess we'll continue keeping on the fight on that front. So with that, I want thank all of you and thank everyone for joining. I think we'll
Thank you so much.
conclude this session.
Learned a lot.
Yeah, we'll conclude the session. I believe there'll be a short break before the next one starts. So I encourage everyone to stick around for that. But thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you have a great day.